Hello. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mari Peduto, and I am a first-year student here at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. I am studying International Studies and Chinese Language and Culture and minoring in Business, Marketing, Southeast Asian Studies, and the Peace Corps Prep program. I am thrilled to welcome all of you to America's Role in the World Conference, and very excited for this conversation between Senator Richard Lugar and Congressman Lee Hamilton, the two men for who I'm sure you know our school is named after. I am also honored to have Marie Harf on campus here to moderate the discussion. Ms. Harf is a national security, communications, and policy strategist who has worked on many issues critical to Americans' foreign policy. She acted as Associate Policy Director during the 2012 election and was responsible for the national security and foreign policy issues on Barack Obama's re-election campaign. Please join me in welcoming Marie Harf and our namesakes to the stage.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. These two gentlemen don't need much of an introduction probably, but I'm just going to give a few facts for people as we begin our discussion this year with the gentleman after whom our school is now named. Congressman Hamilton served in the United States Congress from 1965 until 1999, representing the 9th District in Indiana, was chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, also co-chaired the 9/11 Commission after the terrorist attacks of 2001. And because it's March Madness, I will remind people he's also in the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame.
All right.
That will get the best cheer of this panel, I think. Senator,
That's the only thing they'll remember about me.
that is not true. Senator Lugar served in the United States Senate from 1977 until 2013, the longest serving senator in Indiana's history. He has the Lugar Center, which is in Washington, D.C., and was also chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 2 different stints when he was on the committee. So thank you all for joining today. This is the 5th time the 3 of us have done this conversation. The first was in 2014, which feels like a lifetime ago, on all of these issues we'll be discussing today. We are going to cover a few specific policy issues in our discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions, so please get them ready. We are lucky to have demonstrated to us what a bipartisan, strong American foreign policy can look like through their lives and their work, and the comments you will hear from them today. I want, though, to start with a general question, and it's one the 3 of us have talked about quite a bit, that today it feels here in the United States like there's just this sense of unease. We are deeply polarized. We've talked today about the prevalence of hate speech online. It feels internationally like we are living in a sort of post-global situation. I would say the global community we helped create after World War II, we are living now in something that feels very different. And the U.S. leadership role in the world feels challenged in a way I don't think many of us have ever seen. So there's this sense, and I talked to some students at lunch who have a sense of unease and concern about what's happening here at home and the role we are playing in the world. So looking to both of you to start your comments today addressing what is admittedly a huge topic, but to give some thoughts on the place we find ourselves in sitting here today. Congressman, do you want to start?
Someone asked me a moment ago what I was thinking about this morning and this afternoon as I listened to the panelists. What I was really thinking about was the old adage, it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out loud and remove all doubt. These panels have been so good, remarkably good, each one of them. And Dick, I think the best thing for you and me would be to slip away quietly.
You know I am not going to let either of you get away with that.
I'm delighted to be with Dick, of course. We've done this kind of thing before, but he is an iconic figure in Indiana politics and has had a marvelous record of service to this state and this country. And every time I'm with him, I'm reminded of the contributions he has made. Well, Maria, I think you sum it up yourself very well. You used the word uneasy 3 times. And that's the right word. I think the American people are uneasy. I think they feel a loss of decline of comfort, feeling that the country is not working as well as they would like to see it work. There's an element of pessimism. Mm-hmm. I don't want to overstate that because it can be overstated. But if you look back to the time when I started in politics, there was a real optimism. We can solve these problems. And we tried, and we made some progress here and there, and of course we failed a number of times as well. But the premise was we can solve these problems or we can mitigate them. Now you move forward to today, and I don't think that premise exists anymore. And there, to that extent, there's a kind of a pessimistic mood, I think, that's out there. There are a lot of reasons for that. One is economic. Our economy is growing slowly. But if you are not worried about the inequality of wealth and income, then I suggest you ought to be. It has exploded in the last few years, so that the top 1% or whatever has gained most of the economic benefit. And the rest of us, not so much, even lost some. So it's partly economic and partly cultural. I went down to Scott County the other day. I bet there are a lot of people in this audience that have never been to Scott County, Indiana. One of the fellows that I know well down there said, "Lee, this country has really changed, and I don't like it." I won't go into the conversation in detail, but he feels that it's not quite the country that he knew as a younger person, and that it had become a more complicated country and a more difficult country. And I imagine most of us would agree with that. So it's partly cultural. But whatever the causes are, I think it's a fact. And the policy impact is that it has just, the environment has made it very tough for a politician to make progress. Mm-hmm. Really tough. So I'm often critic of politicians and of the Congress, but I recognize that in many ways their job is a lot tougher than the job I had and Dick had decades ago.
Senator, let's talk a little bit about our role overseas and the unease that a lot of people feel right now. I know you have been very focused on the power of our alliances with NATO, the power of NAFTA and our relationship with Canada and Mexico. These fundamentals, many of us on both sides of the aisle have felt for decades underpin America's role in the world. Do you get the sense that those are fraying, and does that concern you, those fundamental principles?
Without going back too far, after World War II, the United States came to the conclusion that we were going to need to be involved with Europe And having fought that war, we started an alliance, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with the Article 5 idea that in the event that any member was attacked, everybody else would come to the rescue. A remarkable concept, a remarkable treaty. And it is still there. It has expanded a few countries at a time over the course of time. We have a situation, however, in which the President, in his first few visits to NATO countries, indicated, first of all, they were not paying their fair share, that their dues were not coming in. And as a matter of fact, it was not our responsibility to pick up the tab for everybody. And one comment after another of that variety, which began to undermine, certainly, that degree of confidence. It was a fair statement from an accounting standpoint, but the whole point was that NATO is the situation in which we have kept the peace on one side of the ocean. On the other side, we had worked with our Canadian and Mexican friends and really fashioned a trade agreement, quite apart from a security agreement, which, once again, was very, very important for our prosperity as well as our security. Now, suddenly, we're faced with the fact that the President, having really hit NATO hard and really not given ground there, went on to Paris and said we'll not be a part of the so-called Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, that's a post-World War II situation by a long shot. It's out there. It's a big argument in our country as to whether the scientists are right or what the scientists are saying, but the fact is that most of the evidence coming in shows the water's rising, whether it be in the Arctic or along the coasts, or we are seeing warming in various parts of the world, strange situations. And it won't work for the United States simply to be outside the agreement saying we're not part of that. As a matter of fact, we're not really sure of what they're talking about. We had an opportunity with the so-called TPP agreement, trade agreement in the Pacific, to incorporate China along with Japan and South Korea and what have you in a very comprehensive trade agreement with ways of resolving disputes in that way. Very, very important in terms of looking toward our views toward China, our security and that of our allies for whom we've had responsibility out there. To simply cast it off at the beginning, and we've not yet returned to it, although there are always rumors from time to time that we might give that one another try, which I hope might be the case. In short, without going through all of the agreements the President has found unsatisfying, it gets back to the fact that many people believe that the President basically fought his campaign over the fact we were America first, but then we were an America that was in danger, largely along our borders, that we needed to build the wall we are still talking about, and adopt all sorts of procedures with regard to immigration that would stop traffickers in drugs or criminals or various others. It comes at a time in which a great number of countries in Europe, faced with the problems of the war in Syria and ISIS and that territory, have seen huge numbers of people come to their borders. They've tried to work it out. Angela Merkel in Germany very generously has, with the Germans, accepted over 1 million refugees, not without political cost to her.
That's right.
But at the same time, this is not a phenomenon only in the United States. It's a question of people all over the world who are suffering badly, who are in danger of losing their lives, and who have simply taken it upon themselves to get themselves and their families into some safe condition. And so we are preoccupied here in this country with a debate over the wall over immigration, and all the rest of our friends and allies in Europe are facing many of those same problems. And the consequences for them are that the European Union has weakened substantially. We're pleased to see that President Macron in France seems to be making a little bit of a comeback about the time Angela Merkel is moving downward, I'm afraid, in terms of her authority. Somebody really has to keep the store there, whether we like NATO or not, or what we're prepared to do with regard to all of this. So the American public doesn't necessarily take a comprehensive view day by day, analyzing this in a categorical fashion as I've been doing, but senses that essentially the security arrangements that we have spent a lot of time setting up that have been pretty satisfying, really, in terms of our own security, are either being undermined or are failing or are being rejected without there being a lot of alternatives.
Right.
So finally, when we come to a situation that really is very specific, such as do we stay or in the Middle East, in one country or another? And the question is, well, some members of Congress feel we don't want to remove everybody. We want to leave a few folks here, a few folks here, and so forth. But there is a sense there is no comprehensive plan. There's no strategic plan that we have ever developed, really, with regard to all of that.
Right.
And maybe that could be said for the entire circle of what I've discussed, that we really need to come up with the thought of how we are going to become more secure, and at the same time, not only court other allies, but really fasten the ties that we have that are very substantial and that most of our allies really want to have.
Well, and Senator,
Marie, let me just
Yep.
make one point. I just
course.
read the other day, NATO is celebrating its 70th birthday. NATO is the most successful alliance in the history of the world. Most alliances last 10, 15 years, and they think they've had a great run. 70 years. Now, it's now at a place, as Dick suggested, where it's got to kind of change its focus. It's no longer blocking communism spread out of Moscow. And it is changing its purpose. But Dick, I just wanted to kind of reinforce your emphasis on the Allies. This has been an extraordinary alliance. And much of our prosperity and well-being in this country has come about in part because of the success of NATO and our work with the European allies.
I want to add just one quick amendment that I neglected, and that is that we have, likewise, with regard to arms control, a situation, and just recently the United States has backed out of this treaty that tried to control shorter range missiles in Europe. Now, the Russians had violated the treaty, INF treaty, no doubt about that. And so President Trump has responded, well, we're going to get out of it likewise. But it means that there is no treaty. We have the so-called New START treaty, which expires in 2 years. It was very hard to come by.
yes, it was.
And I remember in the final year I had in the Senate, we were working on New START really up through Christmas vacation and so forth to try to bring some limit to nuclear arms in this world, and particularly with regard to the Russians. That is in danger. We are at the same time now talking not in vague terms, but more and more uncertainty about cybersecurity. We used to be worried entirely more about nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. But we understand that with cyber attacks, you might shut down utilities of cities, the hospital systems. You might really wreak havoc in a very different way than the nuclear attack might have, but might have likewise catastrophic costs in terms of lives of human beings.
I think what you both put your finger on the pulse of is a strain among some voters and some members of Congress particularly, and the current administration, that views multilateral treaties or organizations or efforts like the Paris Climate Accord as somehow zero-sum, and do not see the benefit of what we get out of them. We all believe we get something out of all of those efforts. How do you make the case to people that entering into international agreements where we give up something, participate in something, and other people do the same is in our interest? It seems like a basic question, but that principle is being questioned all the way up to the highest levels in the country today.
How do you solve any of these problems without help?
Right.
You cannot solve a single problem that the panel talked about before us. You cannot talk. How do you solve climate change in Bloomington, Indiana? You can't do it. How do you solve arms control problems by not talking to the Russians? You can't do it. So you do these things out of necessity.
Right.
And the great progress that has been made since World War II has come about because working together with like-minded partners, we have tried to spread prosperity and security across the world through our system of democracy and capitalism and freedom and liberty and justice for all. So you have to do it. You don't have any choice. What's the alternative? There isn't any. You got to work with the partners. Took me 10, 15 years to figure that out.
Senator, there is this strain in politics in our country today that is very anti-internationalist. How do you combat that?
Well, first of all, you need to have leadership at the top, the president and his administration, and members of Congress, and people in the academic community, for that matter, who really talk about the world. We all have a responsibility for leadership in this respect. And in the past, thank goodness, there have been many people who did come forward, who offered extraordinary ideas and leadership. For the moment, the problem, and I don't mean to harp on this idea of America first, is that this is not necessarily leadership with regard to other countries. It's sort of an assertion that we will not be trampled on by anybody else. That we're tired of paying the bills, tired of picking up the pieces, and so forth. The facts of life are that there are a great number of Americans who, even during this particular period of time, in my judgment, are still working on agreements. Much of this occurs in the business community. I'm hopeful, at least, and this is very, very parochial sort of situation, but currently we have several trade agreement situations going on.
Yes.
Now, they've started really once again with an America First idea that in the case of automobiles and aluminum, for example, we would not be trampled upon by the Chinese. And so as a result, we would place high tariffs on them, try to discourage their exports. Well, the Chinese retaliated by putting a very high tariff on soybeans that we would sell. I mentioned soybeans because anybody who travels around Indiana and talks to farmers understands, and this seems unbelievable on the face of it, that they say there are still a lot of soybeans in the field. Now, they said that last November, said it again in December. The thought was somehow whether at the elevators the bins would empty, somebody would buy the beans, and you could harvest them and put them in the bins. But that hasn't worked out, not just in the United States,
Right.
but really all over the world. We have gummed up the entire works with regard to food security for people because we are using specific items to retaliate against each other.
Right.
This is going to require some very strong leadership in the business community, in the farm community, and others who say enough of this is enough. In other words, this idea of America first and these extraordinary trade negotiations
Right.
have got to come to a more constructive point. Because otherwise we're going to hurt various industries quite apart from the farmers of America. One would have thought that politically the rebellion here would occur, but surprisingly it is not. People are simply suffering and going bankrupt. And so, when you started the conversation today,
Right.
a lot of hurt, but no one really knows exactly who to blame, who might rescue, what kind of course of action constructively might occur.
Right. And over half of the soybeans, I think, grown in Indiana are sold in foreign countries. Do you still have soybeans
Yes.
at the Lugar farm?
We do. And so that's a very parochial thought. But fortunately, I want to just relieve everybody's mind. We managed to make a sale of all of our soybeans very early.
Good.
Got our money and had a very good year. But now we come up to the planting season. We're about that.
Right.
And what sort of decision do you make in terms of corn or soybeans?
That's right. And Indiana, I think, still this year is the largest steel producing state now. And we talk about manufacturing with steel and aluminum tariffs. You're absolutely right. These tariffs are where the rubber meets the road for voters, for average Americans. And Congressman, if you want to weigh in on the tariffs when it comes to China specifically or just in general, how these are being used and the impact they're having?
Well, let me talk more generally about China.
Perfect.
Whenever I get a tough question, I divert to another topic.
And I always let him do it, so,
I'd rather answer my own questions than yours.
From a lifetime of doing interviews.
China is the most important bilateral relationship in the world is between the United States and China. And it is no exaggeration, I don't think, to say that in no small part, the world history of the next few decades will depend on that relationship. We had better get it right. I am interested in the amount of time we spend talking about China. I noticed almost every panel in the last few hours focused a lot, appropriately, I think, on China. The rise of China is one of the most successful stories in the history of the world. A few decades ago, it could not feed itself. Today, it is the second leading economic power in the world. A remarkable success story. Makes us a little uneasy. Now, China, interestingly enough, we don't emphasize in our discussions, has some horrendous problems. Really difficult problems to solve. And it is by no means sure that China is always going to keep rising. If you talk to the Chinese leadership today, they're convinced They're going up, and we're going down. That's an article of faith with them. I'm not so sure of that. They might be right, they might not. But what we have to do is make sure that we get our own house in order, first and foremost. Our economic system, we want purring along at maximum efficiency. Our political system, unlike the way you opened the discussion, we want solving our problems, or at least mitigating those problems. We do not sufficiently appreciate the competition we are in. I met not long ago with a group of military officers, mid-level military officers in Bloomington, about almost 100 of them, and they are focused on the competition between the United States and China. Really focused on it. And the question is the model that we have or the model that China has, however you describe it, state-sponsored capitalism, or you name it, give it a title as you choose. Which model is going to prevail? Which model is the world going to look to? So I think in our focus on China, there's a lot of things we need to do. I think, for example, we need to push back on China on a lot of things. When they want to make a lake out of the South China Sea, we ought to send our ships through there to keep those waters international. I think we need to be rhetorically much stronger in our condemnation of their human rights abuses and the theft of our intellectual property. So I'm not suggesting we not push back. I think we need to push back. But we don't need to go to war either. The problems we have with China are manageable. Not easily, but by golly, we better learn to manage them. Now, our allies are essential here, as they are in all things. We're going to be stronger in our competition with China if we have the strong support and involvement of our allies across the world. And we can get that. How many allies does China have? I bet you can't name any. You got to be pretty good to come up with one or two or three. How many allies do we have? You can count them by the tens. That's a source of enormous strength for us. And it's a source of enormous weakness for the Chinese. There's no reason to be pessimistic about this competition, but we're going to have to up our game.
Senator.
That's my second sermon of the day, I think. I got 3 or 4 more to go.
We have time. We're here for all of them.
Oh, no, you're not.
Senator, you've worked on arms control a lot, and China plays a key role in the North Korean problem. They have a close relationship. We've pushed the Chinese to do more in terms of squeezing North Korea's leadership. Can you say a few words, or more than a few words, about what we should do now in terms of North Korea and the role that China plays in that? Because you've worked on arms control and non-proliferation for decades.
Well, our administration is just beginning to get underway with North Korea and arms control. Without revealing any particular conversation that I should not. Before President Trump went to Singapore for his first meeting with the North Korean leader, I got word that Mike Pence was hoping that Sam Nunn and I could come over to visit with him and think through, really, so-called cooperative threat reduction. This was the plan with the former Soviet Union, in which piece by piece we moved along with the Russians. With the Russians, the question at that time was they had no money. They were bankrupt. They had come to Sam and to me and they said the arms that are aimed at you right now in some cases have no guards on them. There could be accidents. And then we asked, what do you need? And he said, a lot of your money, a lot of your technicians. That's a tricky business, furnishing hundreds of millions of dollars to the Soviet Union at that point, as well as the technicians to take down the weapons and so forth in a situation of that variety. But in any event, Sam and I went over to see Vice President Pence, and he took us directly to the Oval Office, and we sat, Sam and Dick and the President, sort of in a triangle around his table there, and for about a half an hour, expressed our thoughts about the evolution of cooperative threat reduction, with hopes that some of this might take. He listened to all of it. He didn't argue about it. But nevertheless, the Singapore talks were essentially thought that the president had won victory or something of that variety. Now, there's been no victory won there. The North Korean leader probably needs those nuclear weapons to maintain political control for himself in the country. I think we're a long distance from getting rid of all the North Korean weapons. We're some distance at this point even from getting various facilities shut down that might do tests. The tests may have stopped, we think they have, but they could start again. We're not certain about the production of fissile material, and we think that's probably continuing.
Right.
So you ask about the Chinese involved in all of this. Well, of course, they are concerned, but at the same time, they are, I suppose, intrigued with what in the world we are doing over there. What is our relationship? And our friends in South Korea, of course, are always concerned because they're hoping somehow there might be a declaration of the war, of Korean War had come to an end, that we would offer many more pledges of security with regard to the North Korean neighbors who are up there. I'm not discouraged about it, but I think after all the hoopla and all the discussion about it all the time, not much is happening. And I'm not certain right now that the administration has a very good plan for making something to happen. Now, at the time of cooperative threat reduction with the Soviets, when we had the debate on the Senate floor about the Non-Nuclear Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, there were a lot of Republicans who said, not a dime for the Russians. They don't deserve a dime.
Right.
What in the world? American taxpayer funds. You've got an appropriation here off the bat for $100 million that you're going to send over there. And not something without controversy. We really haven't come to grips with the realities of what is required, really, to get movement in North Korea. We're hopeful that somehow or other nothing bad is going to occur there, and maybe we'll have some good fortune. But I'm not optimistic for the moment until there's a plan there, the same as I suggested earlier on. We just don't have plans with the Middle East,
Right.
with what we're going to deal with the country. So just not a strategic sense there. The president needs to find some people in his administration who really do have the expertise and the wisdom to be able to do that kind of planning.
Let me make a point. Dick referred to the Singapore meeting. That was in 2018. Trump came away from that meeting and he said he and Kim had fallen in love. What in the H is he talking about? Falling in love with Kim? He's one of the most brutal men in the world. The president said, "We've put an end to North Korea's nuclear threat." Baloney! How could you possibly meet with that man and know the record of North Korea and come away thinking you had solved the problem? Our diplomats were passing in the night. They issued a statement. Neither side understood what the other side wanted. Instead of limiting the problem, defining the problem, denuclearization, they just assumed a meeting of the minds. You cannot conduct diplomacy in that manner. This man is a threat to the United States and the world. Now, the good thing, I'd better say something positive here. The good thing is Dick ended up with, they're talking to one another, and they recognize another meeting is necessary. Mm-hmm. Not one more meeting, in my judgment. It's going to take a lot more than one more meeting. But they're open to another meeting, and I may have read the other day where they've decided, do you know, Marie?
There's
They've
been
decided
rumors.
to have another meeting. And for a long time, they were talking about where to meet and so forth. Well, that's a positive thing. We don't really know what this man who runs North Korea is willing to do. It may be that when he talks about denuclearization, he's prepared to do it. But you see, Trump came away from that meeting thinking that Kim would immediately denuclearize the entire Korean peninsula. Look, folks, we can conduct diplomacy better than this. This ought to go down as a record of how not to conduct diplomacy. How not to do it. I hope it's studied in the international school and everywhere else.
Write that down, Lee.
Got a former ambassador down here. He's squirming, I'll tell you that. I don't feel strongly about this at all. But I must say I get upset. These are serious matters. And I don't like to see my country not well represented. I have my problems with President Trump, as you might well imagine. But I do not want him to fail. He's my president. I'm going to make criticisms of him from time to time, and you should too. But I really do not want him to fail. I want him to end his presidency with success. And nowhere more would it please me than success with North Korea.
So when I mentioned the bipartisan foreign policy principles, that's what that looks like. Those comments right there in action. I'm going to ask one more question to both of them, and then we're coming to you. So get your questions in the audience ready. I think there are folks with microphones who will be waiting. This is a question I've never asked either of you, but we spent a lot of time in the morning sessions talking about how members of Congress are scared to take tough votes now. So to each of you, what was the most difficult vote you took when you were in Congress? It can be foreign policy or domestic policy. And I didn't tell either of them I was asking this question, so I'm sorry to spring it on you, but it came to me in the morning sessions when we heard a lot about Congress today being unwilling to do so. Well,
I'll speak up. I voted for Lugar. You think that was popular in southern Indiana? Giving money to the Russians, Dick described that a moment ago. They thought I was nuts. I voted for it. Dick, you've never really adequately thanked me for that.
Well, this is my opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Well, really, it's a remarkable bit of statesmanship by Dick and Sam Nunn. You referred to this, Marie. Mm-hmm. Just think what they've accomplished with that. But politically, looking at it as a politician from Indiana, that was not an easy vote.
Senator?
I can't think of a specific vote. I think that as my career came to near conclusion, there was the rise of the Tea Party group, others of this variety, who and some who felt that it was interesting for me to be traveling throughout the Soviet Union, not weeks at a time, but a great deal of time expended each year for 20 years. As we got appropriations in the Congress changed, the presidents changed, the leaders in those countries changed. Not necessarily my responsibility to sort of bridge all these gaps, but we attempted to do so after Sam left the Senate.
Right.
And so that I think it was simply one of these situations in which I'm grateful that Hoosiers supported me throughout that period of time, in which I was not back and forth to Indiana as often as many times members are these days.
Right.
Frequently somewhere on the face of the earth, but hopefully trying to do the Lord's good.
Amen to that. Okay, I'm coming to the audience now. Who's up first? Yes, we will go with the lovely woman who introduced the panel. And there's a microphone coming.
Senator Lugar, so as a high school student, I was selected for yours and Senator Kennedy's Yes Abroad foreign exchange program. And I ended up living in China through the Nestle Y program. And with our current president's stance on soft diplomacy and his proposals to cut funding for these programs, what do you think this change will have on the world's perception of America and our face of diplomacy and just people being ambassadors rather than ambassadors being ambassadors?
Well, I'm still hopeful the Kennedy Lugar YES program will get the money it needs again this year. I've agreed to speak at the commencement again, as I have for many, many years. This is a program in which a good number of students from abroad come here to Indiana or to other states of the Union and live with families. And they go to high school for the whole year. And they really learn our way of doing things. Likewise, Americans, as you have suggested yourself, go to other countries, live with families. It's a remarkable way of sharing the culture, but likewise gaining some sense of the responsibilities and the problems. Now, all of these programs are at least under some threat of cut this year. And that debate really remains ahead. I'm very hopeful for the best there, as I'm sure you are, because it's very important, that kind of student diplomacy of young leaders for the future, just as those who are here in the international school are going to make a big difference in our world.
I'll go back here to you with the glasses.
So you talked a little bit about how from Indiana, people are, suffering, and it's interesting that there's not kind of a political rebellion because of that. And I think part of that might come from people don't see how foreign policy affects their everyday life. They know that they're, losing money, that there's income inequality, but they don't see how, tariffs and things like that are affecting them. So from, as international studies students or as members of our community, how can we kind of contribute to that, like public education, so that people know these are the policies that are affecting us, even though it seems like they're far away and they're things that only people in Washington understand?
Who wants to start? Congressman?
Well, I think the most important thing for them to understand is that peace in the world is important. If you don't have peace, you cannot solve all kinds of problems, and you have many more problems. So an awful lot of international relations is geared towards establishing peace, calming people down, lowering tensions, lowering rhetoric, and getting people to engage is a large part of the diplomat's business. We don't give enough credit to our diplomats, despite what I said about them a moment ago. But their daily activities of meeting after meeting after meeting, trying to make incremental progress in all kinds of problems, is hugely important. Now, that's part of it. On an economic sense, we live in a very interdependent world. We have to sell our soybeans somewhere, don't we? Now, we can sell a lot of them here, but not all of them. We have one of the most, and I guess it's the most, productive agricultural land in the world, here in the Midwest. And that productivity, the result of it is selling all kinds of products abroad, which is hugely beneficial for the resident of Indiana and of the world. Think of it in human terms. I'm not able to recall offhand, but if you look at the contribution that refugees and immigrants have made to this country, it staggers the mind what they have contributed to this country. We are far more prosperous. We're far better off culturally and every other way because of international influence. And this idea that you can live in your own world today, whether it's Bloomington or Scott County, is just fantasy. You can't do it. So I think I'd make the pitch to them that peace and prosperity depend on engagement with the world.
Senator, you're part of this farming community here in Indiana. Specifically to her point about tariffs and the point you raised, what do you make of the fact that, as you mentioned, tariffs are hurting Indiana farmers, Indiana manufacturing, and yet there's not a political backlash yet? How do we attack that, to either of you?
I don't think that many farmers understand the complications that have put us in this bind. In other words, the Chinese deliberately selected soybeans.
Right.
They believe that would make Trump more vulnerable. Well, to some extent, they probably were correct, but it has not changed his mind that much. In other words, you have the same problem, really, as we're trying to go through the new NAFTA treaty, whatever it comes out in whichever form. The facts of life are that other countries have spotted the agricultural exports as a vulnerability and are deliberately putting tariffs there.
Yes.
And then attempting to shift their purchases to some other countries. Now, they may be too clever by themselves. In other words, the fact is that the Chinese may need more soybeans, and there's some evidence in recent negotiations with them in the last few days. They're talking about buying more soybeans. Other countries are talking about buying more corn because they understand that this does have more of a ring with a lot of the population as opposed to specific owners of steel companies or auto companies or others that are there. I wish that I could fathom exactly where our trade negotiations are at this particular moment, because I suspect that the dilemma here is that there are some in our government who legitimately believe that the Chinese, with regard to our industrial exports or even their investments in the United States, are stealing our trade secrets. That the mistrust with regard to the Chinese in particular.
Right.
And so that really is hard to filter into all of this. But to some extent, I remember last fall, the Trump administration tried to initiate a program in which suddenly they appropriated X number of billions of dollars, and you could get a payment if you were a soybean farmer or a corn farmer during the harvest,
right,
to try to ameliorate
a subsidy program, basically.
some of this pain in the process. And so more of that may occur. There may be handouts of our own government to once again ameliorate the difficulties of our trade negotiations.
Right.
Marie, let me pick up here. I think the American people and Hoosiers are much more conscious about terrorism than you might think. 9/11 was a landmark day in our history. It profoundly shaped American policy, where the government spent its money, and how we secured ourselves in unbelievable ways. We recommended in the 9/11 Commission report that we create a Department of Homeland Security. And we did. And it's now one of the largest departments in government, spends a huge amount of money, tens of billions of dollars. And almost every state has now passed laws creating similar agencies in the state. So the government at all levels, local, state, and federal, have responded massively to the threat of terrorism. But beyond that is you and your personal sense of security. Now, going back a few decades, I can't remember Hoosiers ever talking about their security. Today, you have a public meeting, and let me tell you, it'll come up.
Yeah.
People are wondering about the security of their community, the adequacy of their police force. Talk to the chief of police of Bloomington, Indiana, which I have not done, but probably should. And I bet you he will tell you, as most police chiefs do, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to make this community safer from terrorist attacks, and they should. So I don't buy the idea that terrorism has not penetrated our thoughts and our actions. I think it has. Are we doing enough? Well, look, our record's pretty doggone good. Not perfect by a long shot. We lost 3,000 people, didn't we, on 9/11? Well, since then, how many have we lost? A few at the Boston Marathon. Every life is important, of course. But how many were there? 3 or 4, weren't there, that were killed? And it's very hard to find acts of terrorism. Certainly can find them. But overall, the record has not been bad. So some of our work is important and has, I think, protected our people.
Well, and it's also worth remembering the war we went to in Afghanistan because of 9/11. Now Americans born after that terrorist attack are old enough to fight in that war. And it is still going on, as we talked about this morning. These are the legacies of this event, which I watched from my apartment here in Bloomington in 2001. Yes, this woman right here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here today. It was mentioned how the U.S. should take a harder stance with China by condemning their human rights violations. Following this vein, do you think that North Korea's human rights violations will ever enter in negotiation talks, and should it? Also, what role does human rights play nowadays?
It's a great question. Senator?
Yes, I believe that the human rights activities of the North Koreans should be a part of our negotiations. They should be an important part. And I'm hopeful that our negotiators will, in fact, raise the plight of normal citizens. I don't think we will ever have a solution with North Korea, or North Korea and neighbor South Korea, and so forth, until there really is greater recognition of the human rights of the citizens of those countries.
Look, human rights are very much a part of who we are as a people. We believe in treating other human beings decently. And foreign policy arises from our culture, from our people, from domestic policies and events. My own personal view is that an American diplomat ought never, maybe I'm exaggerating a little here, I don't exaggerate, strike that out. An American diplomat ought never to sit down to negotiate anything with anybody that he does not make or she does not make clear that human rights are important. And we do not come to the table with entirely clean hands. And we have to admit that, because we have human rights abuses in this country, grievous human rights in this country, abuses. So look, you can't be holier than thou, but we've still got an important message, and we have to acknowledge that we're not perfect. We make mistakes, but we, like them, have to make abuse of human rights a central part of all that we do, trying to reduce it. That's part of who we are as Americans. It must be a part of the policy of our country.
How do you respond to sometimes you hear, and we made the argument with the Iran deal in our administration, that sometimes you have to deal with the most pressing security challenges, and when that bumps up against the question of how you raise values, you focus on one at the expense of the other. That's a crass way to say it, but that's an argument you hear. How do you respond to that?
Look, it's not a simple world. You don't deal with one issue at a time. You deal with a whole bunch of issues out there. And are there contradictions and differences? Of course there are. Mm-hmm. If you can't live in a world of contradictions, you better go to the next world. You got contradictions all over. So you do the best you can mm-hmm. in balancing these challenges.
Right.
And so you're right, Marie. Sometimes there are issues that are going to take dominance over human rights. If you got a big-time security issue, that's probably going to be at the top of the issue, the top of the agenda.
Mm-hmm. Senator?
Marie, with the Iran deal, coming back to that, that was important because we were working with our allies mm-hmm. to bring about a situation in which they would give up their nuclear aspirations, or we would impose very considerable sanctions and penalties upon the country. Now, I didn't include that in my initial comments, but right. President Trump rapidly said, terrible deal, worst one ever made, and threw it overboard so that we were out of it. Now, our allies are continuing to try to work with the sanctions, and Iran is very important. But nevertheless, leaving aside human rights, this was just a question, clearly, of our even participating in the continuation of that treaty.
Right.
Look, when you sit down to negotiate, you make progress where you can. You have a dozen or 100 issues in front of you. You can't solve them all. And so among the important decisions you have to make is which ones you just set aside. You can't solve it. And that's often true with regard to human rights, but it's true with regard to all kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. You negotiate where you think you can make progress. When I sat down in the conference committee, that's the final step in the legislative process, that was always a question uppermost in my mind. You had to analyze the group. You had to see where the commonalities were. You understood that with certain members in that conference committee, you were not going to solve certain problems, and you set them aside. On the Iran deal, that's a beautiful example of it. President Obama decided that he wanted to approach Iran. A lot of people criticize that. And he decided that the place he could make progress, he thought, wasn't sure, is to see if he could slow down the nuclear program in Iran. And he made a judgment. And the judgment was, this is really important. Yeah. And so he focused the negotiation on reducing Iran's nuclear capability. So he announces the program, we succeed at that, and he catches holy hell because he didn't solve 15 other problems with Iran, which is right. He didn't solve them, but he solved one of them. Did he solve enough of them? Well, it's a subjective judgment. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe there are 3 or 4 more things he could have done. I don't know. But you can't solve all these problems. You've got to decide in a very pragmatic, realistic way, what can I make progress on? And what can I not do so? Yeah. Your critics are going to come at you because you're not going to be able to solve some problems.
Marie, that makes me reminiscent of that period of time in which Lee was chairing the House committee, and I was chairing the Senate committee. Sometimes we came back and forth as ranking members or chairs, depending upon the parties. But nevertheless, these conferences between the two houses over legislation in which we were involved are very important memories for me. And the excitement of dealing with Lee as a Hoosier at the other end of the table was terrific.
How amazing for Indiana, just to have the two of you leading those.
Dick was a Republican, I'm a Democrat. But we were both internationalists.
Yes.
We both believed that America had an important role to play in the world. We both thought allies were important, and we had a whole lot of other common beliefs. So in almost every vote taken in these conference committees that Dick referred to, he and I voted on the same side.
Yes.
That doesn't happen a lot anymore. Yes, I'm going to go to this woman right here in the front.
Okay, so my name is Caitlin. I'm with the School of Global and International Studies, or HLS. My question was, you just mentioned that both of you view America's role in the world as important, but given the current administration's mistrust of treaties and maybe allies' role in those treaties, where do you view America's role in the future given the implications of the current administration?
Well, my belief and my hope is that Trump will not be president forever. That I understand he has created some special problems for us. He solved some problems, more sometimes I think than he's given credit for. But he's created a lot of problems. You work where you are. And where you are right now, you may not have the support as a negotiator of the President of the United States. Now, that's a big deal in the United States because the President's a pretty important guy. But that's the world you live in. If I had my druthers, a good Hoosier expression, if I had my druthers, I'd have a president who supported the treaties. A politician doesn't get to choose the environment he works or she works in. You got to look around you, see what you can do in the circumstances.
Senator? We're almost up on time, so I'm going to take a bit of a moderator's last question here. And it's to look to the future. And from both of you, and I'll start with Senator Lugar, what are the issues we are not paying enough attention to today? There's a lot of front page news on all these topics we talked about. What are we not focusing enough on that we should be, in your opinion, Senator Lugar?
Well, I mentioned the climate change issue. We are focusing somewhat on that. But I think ahead without having any way of knowing precisely how the years go by. As I think about the future for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, and the kind of world in which they will be living, leaving aside all these trade agreements we've been discussing tonight, or even arms control, or what have you. This is a potentially ominous predicament. Now, the facts of life may be that we just simply are on a planet in which even if we had some unanimity of the leadership of countries of the world, we could not solve the problems that are going to face us, that this is really beyond mankind's ability. On the other hand, it seems to me so important that we try to understand what is happening, what is likely to happen, the implications for everything we do in terms of our geography, our work, our play, our survival. to consider. And I'm hopeful that we will begin doing that. I think that there are young people who do have some thoughts about this, but they really need the support of the veterans of the trail, of people of a great deal of scientific background, engineering background, others who may be very helpful in this respect. I think in the meanwhile, we're going to have problems, I believe, in feeding the world. And at our Lugar Center, this is one of our focal points. How do we work with other countries in terms of their productivity and in terms of their trade, their ability to share supplies and food and so forth? We're probably still going to be in a world for a while in which the population is growing. Well, that's not the case in every country,
Right.
but it's still in the aggregate is the case. And we have, I think, very considerable problems ahead of us in terms of providing that nutrition and the infrastructure of trade, of shipment, of all the rest of it to get the food to people, or we're going to have very large problems of starvation, very great and inhumane difficulties.
I think I would listen to Abraham Lincoln. Whether this nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. I'm worried about the capacity of this nation to deal with the problems coming at us. I worry about the Congress of the United States that cannot be a co-equal branch of government in any sense of the word, and should be. I worry about the executive branch that doesn't seem to understand the problems we have and the urgency of dealing with these problems. Whether this nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure, that was the operational question in 1863, in November. It's the operational question today. I really am deeply concerned about our capacity to deal with what's coming at us as a people. I'm not pessimistic. I'm not optimistic. I just see the challenge.
Please join me in thanking Senator Lugar and Congressman Harf.